Welcome to our podcast. I don't even know what that means, but I'm so happy that you will be joining us and doing a concert of Handel, which I'm sure will be shown in great detail on this podcast. And let me start with my questions. And my question particularly has to do with you being immersed in not only this music, but more broadly the style and the way one performs this music most to your liking with your own group. And so I'm very curious how you, on the one hand, deal with musicians who clearly are not of your group and do not have that kind of stylistic bend to how they play. First of all, how do you have them adjust, if at all? And then how do you adjust? Is it irritating to you? Does it bother you? Do you change your, is it a compromise? Or just how do you feel about that? Because I'm sure this is not the first time that that's happened.
No, and I mean, in fairness, the group that I'm performing here in Santa Fe with is sort of my group. I mean, they're,
Yes.
they're largely players from the Santa Fe Opera Orchestra, who, of course, I mean, this is now my 20th season since my debut there with them in Handel, in Agrippina in 2004. So over the years, we've kind of established some ground rules and an understanding of style. Though, of course, you're completely right. If you're playing on modern instruments, there's a limit to how far you can push this because the sound world is simply different and the actual physical makeup of the instruments is different. If you're playing on gut strings rather than metal or metal wound gut wound strings, it makes a different sound. If you're playing at higher tension, we play at a higher pitch than in 18th century. Higher tension makes a different sound. A higher bridge creates a different issue about string crossing. A modern bow is designed to be totally even from one end of the bow to the other, quite the opposite of what a baroque bow is designed to do, which is to be uneven. And that's one of the biggest things in this music that I try and get modern orchestras to understand, is that this whole concept of evenness in music comes much, much later. I mean, in the 18th century and before, the view was that nothing in nature is flat. Nothing in nature is even. Even if you look at a horizon, if you look at the sea and you look at the horizon, it looks flat. It's not flat. We know the earth is curved. We know that everything actually has a shape. When we speak legato, if you like. I mean, we take a breath and it's all on one breath and we speak. But within the sentence, each syllable, each consonant has a different weight. Now, many orchestral players, I would say most orchestral players, are taught endlessly to make sure their down bow sounds exactly the same as their up bow. This idea that there must be this seamless straight line of sostenuto. And our instruments are designed to do that. So it's really, really hard and essential that we get people to understand that it has to be much more like speech and much less like singing. The second bit of your question, which is about whether it irritates me or not, yes, in a way, it's frustrating that it doesn't just happen naturally. But I also see it as a fantastic challenge because over the last 30, if not almost 40 years, this is what I've been doing all over the world in different houses. When I first worked in Munich in the 1990s, I mean, people walked out of my rehearsals, literally, in a very polite Bavarian way, and just said, "I'm really sorry, but that's not the way I learned to play the violin."
Uh-huh.
What you're asking us to do is just A, not possible, which is not true, but also why would we want to do this? This is not the way we play music. So in a way, it's been a sort of a pioneering thing for me, but it also has been a great joy when I see the way players embrace this repertoire. Uh, and I've just been in Paris doing Julius Caesar with the Paris Opera Orchestra, who have never, literally never played any Handel before in their lives. And yes, we had to work hard at it, but I mean, so many players said, "This is just such great music. I mean, what a privilege to be able to play this music." And much of this repertoire has been taken away from modern players. When I first did Bach suites with the Chicago Symphony, I thought, well, everybody knows Bach suites. And a couple of players came up and said, "Oh, we haven't done this in over 30 years. We haven't been allowed to play this music because we've been told we're a modern orchestra. We can't play this music." Well, I said that's absolute nonsense. Of course they can play this music and should.
So that leads me to then ask, the ideal player for you would be someone who could do both.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I think what so there are two things. One is a kind of an attitude and an openness that allows you to look at the notes on a score and not be literal. I often find myself being asked by the orchestra, "How long do you want that note? It's
Mhm.
written as a quarter note. How long do you want it?" I go, "Well, it's as long. It's a fast bow. Just play a fast bow stroke on it." And they go, "So like an eighth note." And I go, "No." And then I say, "Okay, it's this word. This is the word that's being sung on stage. So it's as long as the word no." And they go, "So like a long 16th." And you go, "No, it's not mathematical, it's gestural. It's all about rhetoric, it's all about gesture." And so players that understand that and are happy to go with that, it's like jazz. I mean, no jazz musician would see four eighth notes on a page and go ba 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 ba. They go
Right.
ba ba ba. They just swing it. But a modern player would say, "So you want it like slightly tripletized?" And you go, "No, it's just swung. It's just not even." But that's very, very hard. And of course, the French have a word for it, inégal. And there's lots of inégalité in Handel because he wrote a lot of, a lot of the music was very French. But it's quite, I think players find it quite either very stimulating or very scary or a little bit of both to be told, "Don't play exactly what's on the page. Let's find what that gesture is." And the other part of this is technical, so that you do need, as a string player particularly, a really, really good bow technique. I mean, and by good, I don't mean it rudely that people don't have good bow techniques, but one which can be super, super flexible. And certainly if you've learnt in the Russian school, for instance, that's very hard for you because, the sort of Oistrakh school of playing is a very, very particular school, which doesn't really allow for the variety of bow stroke, the variety not just of where you play in the bow, but the speed of bow and the lightness of the bow and the flexibility of a bow stroke, where you might have to do a very fast up bow, but with twice the bow speed and half the bow pressure so that it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. And that's something is hard with a modern bow. So we need players who also, are capable of not just mentally doing it, but also physically being able to achieve that.
So it makes me really wonder, what would your sense be of a good education for a string player, a young player going to a prestigious music school? Do they then necessarily need to specialize and only do that? Or is there's, I don't know what the education is. Do you? What are they
Well,
teaching?
I mean, I would say again, compared to 20, 30 years ago, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, Juilliard is now in its 10th year of its own early music department. And that was a school of very, very traditional violin playing. And I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but I mean, it was, Dorothy DeLay and that whole school was incredibly important. And there was also, I think, generally a kind of feeling among her and her pupils that actually the early music movement was not to be taken seriously, that it was basically people who couldn't play the modern violin would play the baroque violin. I think one of your collaborators felt very strongly about that. But I would say also now that you see, Victoria Mullova recording Vivaldi with a period orchestra. You see Andras Schiff recording Brahms piano concertos with the OAE. You look at what Abbado, towards the end of his life, drifted towards, in terms of the way he played Mozart. So, whether you like it or not, these ideas are here to stay, and they're actually kind of wonderful. So I think a lot of young players are now being exposed to these ideas and what it sounds like, and being in the hands of great masters. And that, I think, helps. I think a lot of string players I find also, they have held a baroque bow in their hand. And if you try, even with a modern violin, try just playing with the baroque bow and just see. And suddenly, I mean, the thing I find, again, in Paris, one or two of the players brought their own baroque bows because they just wanted to. And I said, that's fine. And it was interesting. By the end of the run, we did 12 performances. Many, many more started playing with baroque bows. Not because they thought that was what they had to do, but they said, it's so much easier. What you're asking us to do when you play with a baroque bow, the shapes just happen. We don't have to think about diminuendoing at the end of the phrase, because when you get to the end of the bow, it's weaker. So it just happens. So actually it makes our lives a lot easier just by playing with this bow. And I think that's just really interesting to me, that the music comes to life in a way when you actually when you look at what the instruments were, the technical deficiencies of the instruments in some way. I mean, I was a pianist at the Royal College. I never ever dreamt I'd be in this world at all. And I, of course, had heard Bach and Handel, but the Bach was played by the Berlin Philharmonic, and the Handel was played by Richter, who I adored. And, and to me, that was what it was. That was completely what it was. And then, quite by chance, I got asked to play the harpsichord for the English concert, which I now run just as a sort of a last minute extra. And we spent a week just rehearsing Handel's Solomon for the proms back in the 80s. And by the end of that week, I was just like, okay, I had no idea this music could sound like this, and that it could be so powerful, but also the process of putting it together was chamber music. And it was like, yes, there was a conductor, but we also depended on each other so much to listen and to react. And there was so much that was going on that was unspoken. And I thought, this is the kind of music where we can do this. There can be a real synergy.
So do you suspect then that the generation that's now getting older will become the teachers, and that therefore this will become much more prevalent or much easier to study?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's barely a conservatoire now anywhere in the world that doesn't have a period instrument department, no matter how small it is. But I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the number of orchestras there are. I mean, you can actually be employed as a baroque player, probably rather, easier than as a modern player. I mean, but there's so many more groups coming up. And I notice it just with general in the modern symphony world. If I do a Mozart or Haydn symphony with a modern symphony now, I don't even say anything about vibrato. I mean, in the old days, it was like the big battle. When's the conductor going to use the V word? And it's like everyone rolls their eyes and go, "Oh God, here we go." Now I just put a downbeat down, and everyone's already playing in in a way that is at least going towards a style. at least in terms of the kind of vibrato and the kind of bow stroke. And that's without my saying anything. So that's just actually people like me chipping away bit by bit. And then also the concept that you play different music in a different style according to what it is. I mean, as a pianist, I remember really struggling when I was playing, Goldberg variations and things, and there was a teacher that was constantly saying, yes, but you need to do this with your sound, you need to do that with your sound. And I said, but I'm playing Bach. I'm not playing Liszt. And he said, your sound is your sound. And you must, it's not about sound. It's all about your musicianship and your interpretation. I get that, but I think now, I think you would, you go to a recital, a piano recital, and I think if someone starts with some Bach and then some Mozart and then finishes with some Brahms, I mean, I think you do expect to hear a different kind of sound and a different kind of articulation, and I think that's great. I think that's a positive development.
But also, Harry, you conduct all kinds of music. Um, do you feel that you have multiple personality disorder or anything like that? Or is it simply a spectrum, a kind of continuum of different sound, different style?
I think that's it. I think that, and we had uh, well, a principal cello who's actually not here this season, but a great friend, Joe Johnson, who I know plays with you guys. And I remember once when I first got here, just trying to get the orchestra just to lighten up at the end of a phrase or something. And I found many different ways of trying to say it, and some people were just a bit resistant to it. And the last time I tried it, I said, maybe just slow the bow down there, or whatever. And Joe just said, or just be musical. I said, that's sort of what I'm trying to say, but maybe it's better coming from you than coming from me. So I think that's one of the things is that actually I don't think any of these things that I talk about doing Handel are somehow not applicable to doing Debussy or to doing Wagner or anything. And the best players completely get that. It's not about a sort of dogma. One of the things I do think that by doing period instrument stuff is, well, two things. One is the thing I've touched on, which is not to be so literal about the score. And I don't mean that to run roughshod over a score. If you do a piece of Stravinsky or a piece of Britten, the challenge is simply to do everything that he writes in the music. I mean, these scores are so over annotated in a way, it's almost impossible to achieve everything they're asking, but it's like a degree of control freakery that, they had, and because they wanted their music to sound exactly like that wherever it was done in the world. But if you do Mozart or Beethoven, or even through to Rossini and potentially even Debussy, sometimes we did Pelléas last year. There were loads of places where it was clear it wasn't very consistent within the parts, and you have to make a kind of decision. That is interesting to me, that how do composers write something down, what it is in their head, and how it's transferred into notation, and also how totally inadequate notation is. And you see that now with modern pieces. Often you see a contemporary piece, and it's like every bar is a different tempo or different uh, uh, gesture. And I look at it sometimes, and when you hear it, you go, couldn't the composer just have written rubato over it? But instead, they've actually written out every piece of rubato, like in such kind of controlling way. So one of the things is just looking at the score and trying to, first of all, find out what the music is meant to be, rather than be sort of limited by bar lines and everything else. And the other thing for me is that I always approach things through the prism of what was happening before it, not what was happening after it. So if you do Fidelio, Mozart had barely died. I mean, he literally was within months. At Beethoven in Vienna, exactly the same, hometown almost, writes this piece, this crazy piece that is beyond anything anyone has ever heard before. So if you look at Beethoven through the prism of Mozart rather than through the prism of Mahler, who championed the piece, then you get a very different sense of what that music must have been, how shocking it must have been. Now it sounds quite conventional in harmonic terms and gestural terms, but back then, so how do we recreate that idea? Same thing doing Pelléas. I mean, this, at the home of the Opera Comique, which was the home of Offenbach, where families took their kids for a nice, gentle afternoon of opera in Paris. And then this 30-something-year-old guy turns up with this crazy metal ink play where nothing really happens except that there's sort of a very dark underbelly of these very unpleasant characters in this music which has no arias, which is all recitative. Well, yeah, then that, if we look at it that way, instead of, oh, it's one of the greatest tone poems ever written, then you find a kind of rhetoric and a gesture that hopefully means something different. So we look at these pieces like they're brand new.
But it's quite impossible to recreate as if history had not happened up until now. So how do you make that revolutionary or surprising if we've already heard everything that comes after? That's a problem.
You're completely right. And of course, the one thing you can't be authentic about is the audience. So
Right.
the audience's ears were hearing something they'd never heard before. Our ears are hearing something that we've heard 100,000 times.
Right.
No, I completely agree with you. The point I'm trying to make is more that as musicians, we approach it like it's constantly surprising and shocking and different and
Right.
new, rather than, I mean, I'm doing Giovanni at the moment at the opera, and of course, these players have played it a million times. I mean, probably not quite a million, but almost. And don't even need to look at the music, but that can be dangerous. That can be difficult, because you can just sink back into a kind of a gentle familiarity, like it's a nice warm woolly sweater that you wear on a cold night, but actually that's not really what the piece is, and certainly wasn't intended to be like that. So we have to, refind the excitement of the gesture, even though the gesture is something that we have heard before and we know is coming. But how wonderful to do that piece and also remember that some people haven't heard it before, but that even people who have heard it before want to be re-surprised by it, if you like.
And Harry, speak a little bit about the actual piece that we're going to hear in the concert and what changes were made due to being on the water and then not on the water.
Well, I don't think any changes were made, frankly. I think that,
Really?
I mean, I think that, it's the whole thing of playing outdoors was, it was a bit like Mozart serenades. They on one level, I can't imagine what these performances were like.
Mhm.
And but what was brilliant, both with the Mozart serenades and with this water music, is that Handel, there was no sense in which he was going, oh, for God's sake, no one's going to listen to this music, and it's going to, we're not going to be heard, and we're going to be eaten alive by mosquitoes, and everything's going to be out of tune, and it's going to be miserable. He puts his heart into it and writes this incredible music. We're really very uncompromising as well. I mean, a lot of it's very virtuosic. And, if you were thinking about writing music for people being towed on a barge along the Thames, virtuosic is not the first adjective you reach for. You just go, can we just write something that's going to not fall apart? But he doesn't. So I think that's really interesting. Of course, the horns and trumpets, they were anyway seen as outdoor instruments, if you like. The natural horn is really like a hunting horn, valveless and and quite it's not as burnished, if you like, as the modern horn. The trumpet, again, natural trumpets are loud, and they're loud in a different kind of way. For the strings, again, I can't imagine really how that worked out. But again, it's there. The music is constantly evolving. It's constantly surprising. These dance forms are traditional. I mean, everyone knew what a minuet was and a bourrée, rigodon, and all these kinds of dances. But Handel kind of reinvents them in a way that's uniquely his. And as always with Handel, it's not it's so distilled. I think it was Beethoven that said that if you want to make the biggest gesture with the fewest number of notes, look at Handel.
Mm.
And of course, Beethoven himself didn't take that advice, but I think that what's really interesting is that it's true. It's deceptively simple. And of course, when you're using horns and trumpets, basically horns, because they're natural horns, only have 4 or 5 notes they can play. Same thing with the trumpet. So harmonically, you're kind of trapped. You can't modulate. But amazing to write all this music in F major that is just doesn't feel like it's all the same key. You just get the sense of this wild imagination.
So do you suspect that, I mean, I imagine that he took the idea of it being on a barge as, a minor inconvenience to the longevity.
Well, but you have to remember that longevity wasn't a word that existed in musical ideas in the 18th century because everything was about new music.
Right.
I mean, you really were forgotten. It doesn't matter. You've written Messiah. You couldn't just go, oh, I'm going to retire. I mean, Messiah, that's it. You were only as good as your next piece, and he did that right until the moment he died because I mean, not just financially because he was having to earn a living, but you didn't get the kind of royalties of recordings and publishing and media and streaming. You wrote the piece, and then you better get on with the next one.
Right. Right. And talk a little bit about the brass. How much does that irritate you?
That irritates me much more in a way.
Mhm.
And the oboes, really, really hard, because oboes, baroque oboes are wooden. Then they have fewer keys. They have a much softer reed. So that means that they can play in a rounder way, which more often than not, oboes in baroque orchestras are actually playing violin parts, and they're part of the violins. And so and again, a baroque oboe will naturally blend with the violins. And also because of the soft reed, they can double tongue so fast that the articulation is not a problem. With a modern oboe, modern reed, it's very, very hard to double tongue as fast as the strings play. And also those instruments are designed to be soloists. So they can't really just blend in with the violins in the same way. It's much, much harder for them. And for the brass, yeah, I mean, there's no real solution to it. I can ask the horns to be a little bit more kind of agricultural in the sound that they make, I can't think of an adjective other than that. I mean, just a little bit more hunting and outdoorsy. And for the trumpets, one of the issues is that because it lies quite high, they naturally want to play on piccolo trumpets, and that sound is completely just not what Handel was intending. I mean, it's a natural trumpet is a very long instrument. It's got a lot of brass in it, and for that reason, again, it has a very full but round sound. It's not tight. It's very, very open. So we'll see. I mean, it's still thrilling to have those when the horns and the trumpets are playing and the full ensemble. And with the players that we've got, it's totally thrilling. So you mentioned earlier in your introduction about how much was a compromise. And of course, it's a compromise. Absolutely. But I don't try and make that a problem.
Right.
I think it's a glorious compromise. And with great players and great music, it sort of doesn't matter. You know, to get into a controversial subject, when someone comes and plays Bach on a modern Steinway, yeah, total compromise. But I don't mind. I love it. It is what it is.
Well, and then we have, the seasons performed by an orchestra of kotos, or any kind of anything, 17 harmonicas.
Right.
Uh, the essence is there.
Completely.
You've heard the famous interview with my colleague?
No.
Oh, there was one radio interview. I mean, this was 40 years ago, 30 years ago, where he went just absolutely berserk about this. And I think that built his reputation as the anti-authentic anything. And his diatribe was mostly about the audience. That if you really wanted to be authentic, everyone should arrive in horse-drawn carriages. Uh, there should be no electricity. Everything should be with candles, and otherwise, it's all nonsense. But he was he could have been a Russian school, uh, and that's that generation. That's how they grew up, and this is so difficult for them to absorb.
No, I completely agree. And in many ways, it's the way I grew up as well. And it
Yeah.
was it was just by chance in 1986, was it, or something? No, before that, 1980 probably. And I was studying the Bach first suite for my O levels, which is an exam that we take in the UK when you're 16. And I didn't know anything about it. So I went out to the record store library, and I got two different recordings thinking, well, I'll listen to two. And the first one was the Munich Chamber Orchestra, with Karl Richter, but I mean, who did a lot of that music, I mean, really wonderfully, with a big thing of doing Bach. And then my generation all grew up with that. And it was, I remember thinking, well, okay, it's what it is. I mean, of course, it's nice music, but I just thought it's fine. And the other one was a new recording by the English Concert and Trevor Pinnock, which is an orchestra that probably only just been founded. And I put that record on, and I remember actually getting the two records and thinking, if I bought the same piece, I mean, it's actually the same piece, because how can these two things be so different? And it just made this music leap out of the page at me. And it's not to say that I wouldn't still love to listen to the Carl Richter one as well. I mean, it's just, you get more. I mean, you must have found this. The more you get absorbed in a particular composer or world, or it's not that I think I'm right. It's just that I can't do it any other way.
That's very well said. Uh, I wanted to tell you a little bit about this notational thing, which is kind of fascinating to me also. Uh, the best of them, to me, are Beethoven, Brahms, and Schubert, where the marking, if you understand the markings as they're meant, uh, it's everything you need and not too much. If
Exactly.
Yeah, if you go, I mean, I remember we played a lot of Takemitsu, who I love, and that is, if you take literally every measure, every note has so much information that it's like a straitjacket until you realize that if you play naturally, well, naturally musically, it comes out exactly the way he's trying to put it down anyway. But then if you go to Bach and Handel and all of that. There's nothing. There is absolutely nothing in terms of telling you how you were supposed to do this. And so I'm assuming that they just took it for granted that anyone alive at that time knew how you were supposed to do this.
No, it comes almost totally from music publishing and the beginning of the dissemination of music all around the world, and also the beginnings of co-productions of operas or symphonies being played outside wherever you were. I mean, of course, you don't need to write anything down. If you're writing it for your local orchestra and they're totally imbued in the style of what you're doing, you just say, well, here are the notes, and they're going to do that. And the French are going to swing that phrase. I don't need to write inégal. It's just they're going to do it. But what happens if that music is going to be done in London? They're never going to know what to do with that. So I better write something in. And we see that in later, like in Gluck, where pieces were done in Vienna. And then they were huge successes, and Paris said, we'd really love to have that piece come to us. He rewrites the whole thing. I mean, he just starts writing all this information in because he knows that there's no way they're going to do that naturally. So in many ways, no, that you're right. The fact that these things, Bach and Handel, don't have that much in it is precisely because they didn't think it was going to be done outside of Leipzig or Vienna. So why bother writing that in? And I think it's absolutely composers beginning to wanting to have more control over the way in which their music is played. That starts this thing of how do we notate this stuff. And you're completely right, actually reading what those notations means, because then you get into the trap that players in those places knew what those notes meant. I mean, Mozart's constantly got these daggers he writes over the top, and it's like no one really knows what they mean. I mean, some people think it means often people thought it was staccato, but actually that doesn't make sense in some places that should mean staccato. Harnoncourt had this theory that actually they were like little exclamation marks, and he said basically it means watch out and don't do what you would naturally do there. So his argument was it could actually mean longer. Now it's an interesting idea, but it's true. I mean, we look at these things and we don't really know exactly what they mean, but it does, at least, as you say, focus the mind on he wanted something special here. Beethoven often writes, andante ma non troppo e poco allegro or something over these
But he
movements.
never saw a car.
Well, yeah, and then you go, maybe it just means just take care over this tempo. I don't know, because otherwise it just means, sort of not too fast but not too slow, but maybe this or maybe that. And it's like, no, we don't really know what that means.
Right.